And then I also, and so that is a God within, a God like peace, love, concepts. And not quite as long ago, but I also learned the term trans value. And so that really helps a lot when I read the traditional prayers. And if you understand Hebrew and how you can say the prayers by transvaluing the concepts.
Lovely.
I have a message in the chat.
Yeah, there's several messages. Could you read those out?
There was
Yeah,
a
we're
clarifying
gonna-
question
oh.
over here too.
A clarifying question first, and then we'll go to the chat. Oh, yeah, the clarifying question is,
Trans value.
what is trans value? Yes.
It's putting a different value. I mean, it's a little like the metaphor that, which we'll get to, that Rabbi Toba Spitzer says. So not reading what you're reading directly, but changing the value of what you're reading.
Yeah.
And
let's hear the just a couple comments from the
You
chat.
should be able to use this.
Okay, so
Okay.
hopefully you'll be able to hear Jillian here.
Okay, so Marcy Epstein says, greetings, I'm pleased to meet and learn with you all. I'm also driving to Kentucky to look at the bluegrass and taste the bourbon, so I'll be listening mostly. My theism is comfortable, oddly, and I enjoyed the kennings of water and more, the constellation of metaphors today. Good sheet, thanks for sending Jillian. Finally, thanks Adam and Deb and the committee for arranging today's learning. Dina says, I agree with Debbie for other reasons that talking about God is complicated. Claudia says, God language feels alienating to me. Any anthropomorphizing of God doesn't make sense to me. I prefer thinking of God as the awesome miracle of this infinite universe and the small chance that we each had to receive the gift of this life.
Awesome.
And Carla agrees. She sent me a message privately. Idel shared an article.
Great.
That's what we got.
And now we're all caught up.
All right, great. Okay, so with
Yeah.
that, then let's dive in. So we're going to base this session, I think, as someone alluded to, on an article by Rabbi Toba Spitzer entitled "God and Metaphor: Guide for the Perplexed." This article is set to become a book in like a week and a half, I think. So I have pre-ordered it. So if you enjoy today's session, Toba Spitzer on wherever fine books are sold. So what she says is that and this is the first quote you have, what I've come to understand in recent years is that the God problem that so many people have, the difficulty of believing in or even taking seriously the notion of some kind of all-powerful, all-knowing being that interacts with us in mysterious ways, is not really a problem with God. Rather, it's a reaction to a metaphor or a set of metaphors that have come to dominate our thinking about God. What is sad is that once upon a time, our ancestors employed a rich palette of metaphors to shape their experiences of the divine, metaphors that spoke directly to their everyday experiences. So she makes the point that metaphor ultimately is not the same as definition. So when you hear that idea, metaphor is, especially when it comes to God, metaphor is not the same as definition. Any reactions to that immediately before we dive into sort of how she takes that? I see your head nodding, Debbie. Yeah.
I'm not sure what that means.
My immediate response is yes, because metaphors can be images or stories or pictures or I'm thinking of the metaphor of Jacob's ladder, which is an image, immediately gives you an image. And so metaphors may go beyond words.
Okay. Yeah, other thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to use this mic.
Yeah,
Can people hear me okay? Okay, great. So as someone who spends the majority of my time during the week with children under the age of 5, I think that one of the challenges that Rabbi Spitzer is touching on here is that as people, it's difficult for us to hold things that seem antithetical or paradoxical at the same time. So if God is both concrete and a metaphor, then which one is it? And I think being with young children who like literally can only think concretely in some ways, but who also have the ability to imagine possibilities that we as adults cannot imagine, is a good practice in sort of holding that paradox that like a child is both called Tinkerbell and some other name at the same time, and their identity is whole in both of those aspects, for example.
Can you read this too?
On the other hand, this is Deb Krause. On the other hand, little kids aren't concerned about the contradiction in that because they don't have the cognitive ability to, and we do. So that only takes us so far.
Right, to children, it's not contradictory. To
Right.
children, it's all part of a cohesive whole. And I think also young children really have not encountered the social stigma attached to having some idea that someone else thinks is preposterous. Especially not the kids that are in my school, where we basically encourage everything. In the chat, Lisa is also saying, this seems right. It allows for tapping into a small part of a bigger thing.
So we're all just, I mean, we're speaking that children are Kabbalists, I guess, right? They just believe that God has many different aspects. And yeah, I love that. So the metaphors that she touches on specifically as being like these dominant metaphors are ones like king and creator of the universe. So let me ask, like, when you hear God as king, what do you think the point of that metaphor is? If we're thinking of it in terms of not defining God, but rather trying to understand God, what is the point of the metaphor of king? And particularly paying attention to the historical context, the ancient context in which that metaphor comes into being. What do folks think? Yeah. Oh, we got a microphone here. Yeah.
It's one of reverence to the king.
Reverence. Okay.
I think for me,
And that's Seth talking.
Oh, Seth, thank you. I feel like there's a lot of like patriarchal dominance in the writings, and it has influenced a lot of these metaphors to turn a lot of people off. Turns me off too. So I do think it is something like to have reverence and to say this is the ultimate almighty. But I think the leaning towards male being the dominant piece is, I think, is a human construct, in my opinion. So for me, that's why sometimes talking about God can be tricky, right? I do see it more as a global energy force that has, to me, I feel consciousness, but I don't see it as a white guy with a beard.
Right. And I think so the king thing, yeah, I see a few more thoughts here. And so the king thing, when we think about the context that it's appearing in, right? Imagine you are an ancient person. Who is the single most powerful person you know? And the king, right? And so I sort of think of this as being, that guy who's so powerful, this is the king of that guy. Like the king of, this is where Malchei Hamlachim, the king of kings, comes from. It's this notion that God is the king of all the kings, God's the king of them. So there's this notion of relative smallness, relative powerlessness, I think, that kind of comes with this metaphor. At least how I interpret it. Yeah.
Carol Usher, that was what I was going to say, all powerful. But the other part, as Seth was talking, reminded me of the fact that so many sovereigns claimed their power came from a higher being, from a deity. That is also powerful.
Well, because immediately the question, well, why are you the king, right? And your power has to come from somewhere, right? Yeah, totally. Are there any other thoughts?
I have one in the chat too.
One in the chat. Yeah, go ahead and read that while we get the microphone up there.
Kevin Norris says, I think of the king metaphor as a statement that I am not in control of things. Some other force it. And Marcy says, the God of Torah is a God of construct.
Ooh. I wish Marcy was here so she could explain more. That's a really interesting thought. Yeah, so we're not going to ask for more right now, but an intriguing, my brain went, ooh, that's really nice. Yeah. Please, Erica.
This is Erica. And I think for a lot of people, the importance of having God as a king and the importance of having religion in general is to have a moral code and a legal code. And so having God as a king, having God as a king then means that the 10 commandments are absolute.
You have to follow the rules.
Right.
Yeah,
So.
totally.
This is Carol Kaplan. I have a lot of problems. Seth probably and I are on the same page with King, but I definitely can understand how a society, an ancient society, would want to make order.
There's comfort in it, right?
There's comfort in order. So if it wasn't a negative connotation to them, King, as it is to us, I think more often these days, it might be comforting.
Well, and one has to, I have wondered this as I've taught this. I wonder if like an English synagogue would have a significantly different reaction to the king metaphor, a country that still has a monarch, whereas we are like very anti-monarchical. A queen, and we will talk about, yes, and then that's a, the English synagogues really do. Do they say, may the Lord keep and bless the queen far away from us, or like the, you know, the Fiddler on the Roof thing?
When I was in Scotland for a brief period, but according to my sister, this is how services started. It started with a blessing for the queen.
Huh.
So, and I don't know what order that was in, but it was part of the start of services.
Well, boy, that is a fascinating thing. Yeah, I thought over here. Right, not the queen of, not the God queen. Yes, queen.
Hi, this is Evan Franklock. Well, I think we touched on this now, but I think the distinction between like an elected ruler and a more arbitrary one is key, because God is a lawgiver, but the legitimacy is arbitrary. We can't elect God, and so when we're in the court of God, we accept the authority kind of as a given without being able to re-elect or question the reason for the law giving. There's kind of a deferral because the monarch is such a given lawmaker, a wise ruler for unknown reasons.
Yeah. So I have to go off topic for a second because that just jogged my. There's in the Talmud, there's two accounts of the people Israel receiving the Torah. Does anyone know this? There's two accounts.
Go on.
Okay, so the one is that God literally holds Mount Sinai above their heads and is like, do you accept it? Right? So there's this is not an accepted, this is a very much coerced accepting of the Torah in this version, but there's a different version that says that God went to every people on earth, all 70 nations, and Israel was the only nation that said yes. So in this sense,
what it was.
Right. And so there's this notion in that version where we are chosen by God, but we also chose God, which I think is actually kind of a really interesting idea. Kind of gets at what, not elected, but it's a question that the Talmud has thought about. So let me throw one more metaphor into the hopper, which is God as Father, which is another one we're probably familiar with, also very complicated. And so the metaphor of parent is really speaking about, returning home, coming back to that which loves us and accepts us and whatever. But the father metaphor still also for a lot of folks feels very ish. So I want to ask, if God is mother, does that feel significantly different to people? And if so, in which ways? I would love just to throw that out there for a second. Deb, please.
This is Deb. It feels more nurturing. It feels, it just has a different flavor to it. It feels a lot less patriarchal, for those of you who are going to say that.
Yeah, I got a thought over here as well. And if you could say who you are. Yeah,
sorry, this is Becky Ball. It's interesting because in my own experience, my own father is very nurturing. But when I think of the term father in sort of an abstract way, one thinks of someone who's much more stern.
More distant.
Right, more
remote.
distant.
Yeah.
Which I think would make sense for a God that, that they couldn't actually interact with. But I think, and this is sort of getting at what Carol was saying earlier, that in a society, pre-science society where things happen and people didn't understand why they were happening to them, natural disasters and things like that. I think having some sort of father figure who seemed to be the one who takes care of the family, which is what the father figure has always traditionally been, I think that would be very comforting.
Interesting. So there's something, well, and that makes sense, right? When we think about when we were children, if you don't understand something, speaking normatively, if you have a normal parent, who do you ask for everything? Who do you ask to explain every single thing? It's your parents, right? And so there's this notion that like, there's all these scary things that are going on and I have no idea what's happening because we don't have science. And you know, like imagine like someone, you know, lightning, if you didn't know what that was, like, God, that'd be scary as hell. Like that, what a scary idea, right? Yeah. Seth, please.
This is Seth. It feels to me like a lot of this language, if we boil it down, is almost rooted in fear or creating fear. Like,
thanks for coming.
You know, having these rules, if you don't do it a certain way, like God is like you should fear God if you don't do things a certain way. Calling it a male, I think, helps with the fear aspect. And for my personal exploration, I feel like when I've tried to connect to God through fear, I don't feel like I was really connecting. I was
being coerced.
I was feeling like I was connecting from a part of me that's like hoping I do things right. And then when I finally kind of asked the fear of me to step aside, and I'm like more in my true self, I feel like I actually connect with something that's like holding in a beautiful way. And this whole aspect of God is just judge and kind of holding all these rules, I still think that's a human construct. And that I don't feel that my personal belief is, I think God is more of something that can hold you if you're ready, but not something that's like criticizing you and judging you.
Yeah, that's lovely.
I have a comment.
Yeah, please.
So Claudia Piper says, it seems that the king metaphor is of the past and not meaningful to us, even in these times. Even in England, the monarchs are no longer considered absolute rulers. I find it cumbersome to use ancient concepts and have to keep translating into a more meaningful construct throughout the service.
That's really interesting. Well, maybe you notice that in the prayers we did at the beginning, Melech HaOlam, I did not translate as King of the Universe because it's alienating. So I tried Sovereign of Eternity, which is not that much better, but it's a little bit. It's an attempt to try to make the metaphor work better. So I want to dive into a couple of the metaphors that Rabbi Tova talks about. I think we're going to skip water for the sake of time, although it's a really interesting one. So actually, I'm going to read her take on water for a second. So we'll skip the psalm and just go straight down. So she says, water is one of the most common metaphors for God in the Hebrew Bible and is used to convey a range of experiences, being nourished by life-giving rain, being swept along by a powerful river, joining in the flow of justice. Just as a body of water can buoy us, refresh us, and sustain us, it can also become fearsome in a storm and overwhelm us. This can be a powerful metaphor for our own experiences of the sacred. Sometimes we seek spiritual nourishment. We long to drink from Peleg Elohim, the God River. At other times, we feel buffeted by the waves of our lives, ups and downs, and seek reassurance, as in the words of the prophet Isaiah, when you pass through the waters, I am with you. Water is life-giving, essential, and powerful, sometimes beautiful and sometimes scary, just like life, just like God. So for a moment here, does water feel like a significantly different metaphor than what we've been talking about? And does it feel like right to you, or does it feel wrong still? I'm just curious, we'll take a few moments for this before we jump in. Yeah.
Hi, home friends. This is Rena Bash. It gets us out of the things that, the king and whether you change the gendering of the sovereign word, that doesn't matter to me. And so this idea of using the water metaphor really does kind of bring us to a different time period, to reference what Claudia said, in that it's now understood from a holistic, scientific, a spiritual standpoint, how vital water is to life. And so from that standpoint, it like just having this completely new kind of metaphor actually feels kind of cool.
Yeah.
coming in from the chat, Joey commented at Svara, one teacher uses ruach instead of melech in the prayer for Torah study.
Yeah, totally. And many Reconstructionists do use the ruach, meaning breath or wind or spirit. It's a really, really multifunctional word. It's a great word. Thank you for, yeah, Svara. And Svara is like, they run queer Talmud camp. If you ever, Svara is really cool. They're really, thank you for that reference, Joey. Yeah, other reference or reactions to water, particularly before we jump
I
into
have
this.
one.
Yeah, please.
That's my own.
Yeah, please.
I think Lisa had typed into the chat a while ago when you had first asked about God as king, and had commented one word, which is power. And I, as we were having that conversation about God as king, it's very clear that like at many points, like the concept of God has been used to wield power or get power or take power or have power over other people all the time. And what's interesting to me about the water metaphor is that like water is a powerful tool, right? It's like the sustainer of all things that are living, but also like water can erode rocks over time and right, or have the power of a flood.
Yeah. So I'm here, it captures more of the complexity of God than the king thing does for you.
Yeah.
Because water's a lot of different stuff. I mean, water is at once deeply powerful, but water also takes the shape of whatever you put it in, right? So like it does, and can be frozen, and it can be liquid, and it can be gas. Like it is such a multi-valenced kind of metaphor that it really captures sort of the complexity of maybe what the divine is in a certain way. Yeah.
Dave here, Nelson. And I think the quality of water that I really like in this context is that it's outside of human things.
Mm-hmm.
You wipe all the humans off the globe, the water is still here. And while the power of kings, I mean, it's appropriate to God because it's frightening. Political power is really, really frightening.
Mm-hmm.
But geez, I've lived in Michigan all my life around the big lakes. And political power is not as frightening as the water if it gets big when you don't expect it and you're out in it. And that feels super important to me. That like, yeah, it is a tool that we yield and a thing that we need, but it's always kind of, for anyone who's ever had a plumbing problem, like it's for real, like it's indefatigable. And that piece seems much more to get at the heart of how I'm feeling this than kings with swords and such.
As cool as kings with swords are. Yeah, totally. Yeah, right. I mean, like, who doesn't like kings with, I mean, I don't know.
A couple other words from
the chat here.
So Claudia is saying water is also the womb of life on earth. And Marley is piping in to say water doesn't have human desires in the same way a king is in danger of being a tyrant.
Right.
Water just is. And then Marcy jumping in to say actually something that I think is a great question, which is metaphor really necessary? So it's
a good question. I mean, what I would say to that is I think we can't talk about God without metaphor. And so like, it's well, do we have to, I mean, we don't have to talk about God, I don't think, but I think it is really difficult to not talk about God with metaphor. That's how humans talk about things generally. The things that we can't articulate exactly straight, we use metaphors like as creatures. That's part of what we do. Yeah, over there.
Oh, I was just going to say, this is Becky. Simply that water as a metaphor, and I love all of the discussion of the power of the water, but I think too, sitting beside a babbling brook
can be so peaceful.
It's so peaceful. There's so much joy and spirit in it. And the fact that it flows, it moves, it's not static. To me, that also speaks to God.
Well, that is an excellent transition into our next metaphor, which we're going to jump into. So the next one is God as Ehyeh. So does that word ring a bell to anyone before we jump into it? Ehyeh. It is similar to Yahweh. That is true. So what's that? It has, yes, it is a version of the word Haya, to be in Hebrew. It is I will be. So if I say I will be, does that ring a bell? Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I will be that I will be. Okay, we've probably heard of that. Yeah. So this comes from the book of Exodus. So this is the scene where God has appeared in the burning bush and says to Moses, you have to go to the Israelites and tell them who I am. And Moses says, when I go to them, what do I tell them your name is? Which is an odd, it's always struck me as an odd question. Like, they're like, the God of your fathers. I'm like, what's his name? It's just an odd thing, but that's what they got. Moses is sure they're going to ask what his name is. And God gives a kind of complicated answer. So God says, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. So we're going to break that down for a second. So Ehyeh, as Erica pointed out, is a form of the word Hayah, to be. And Ehyeh is the future first person. So I will be. And then there's this word Asher, which is a very complicated word for anyone who knows Hebrew. Asher is a lot of different things. It can be who, it can be which, it can be that. So we end up, I often just write out Ehyeh, as I did here, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, because it's so hard to translate what God is saying. But so God says, so Moses says, what is your name? And God answers, I will be that I will be, or I will be what I will be. And then Moses pushes back, actually. I kind of skipped this part, but Moses is like, there's actually, there's a midrash. So a midrash is like the category of text that fills in the gaps, basically, in the Torah and in the Tanakh. And so there's this one midrash that says that, Moses kind of pushes back against, so what he says is, this people is dealing with so much right now. Can you not talk about the future too much right now? And that's, so it's a weird take. But then God, you can see, modifies God's name and then says, just Ehyeh. So I will be. So what do we think of this notion of God saying that God's name is I will be?
It's certainly full of potential.
Potential. Can you say more?
No.
No. Okay. Great. That's fine.
Hi, it's Carol. I actually heard it taught once, and I'm wondering if this is even real. I am becoming what I am becoming, which was like, I don't know why, revolutionary to me in the sense that God evolves, or maybe God evolves to us, which is what we've been talking about here today.
Right. So there's a suggestion that God is in process, which is God isn't static. God isn't stagnant. God is like us. God is changing. Yeah, Debbie.
Well, and this is a great counterpoint to that, because when you said that, I thought of being present. So just as God is constantly changing, I will be, or the sense of being is, to me, speaks of being present. And when we're present, we are, I think, when we're fully present, we're closest to the truth, whatever that might be. And that truth is probably multifaceted, but there's a presence there in I am, just I am. So,
interesting.
Which also could be an evolving presence. So.
Well, and you're actually making a linguistic point here is that Ehyeh is actually in the Hebrew tense called the imperfect, which is not exactly the same as the future tense. What it means is that it hasn't been completed. So not necessarily the future. So I am is actually a good it's a sort of in between I am and I will be. It's an uncompleted process. God is still in process. Yeah.
All right, this is Seth. I've heard that part of the, like the way we write God, like, I don't know, it's like, it can't be spoken. And I get a sense that it can't be conceived. Like, so I almost sense that when you say something like I will be, it's like, it's not something that you can cognate, it's something you have to feel. And I think the human realm is not, you can't name it. We can't understand it in this realm. But like, what does it mean to be? It's more of a felt sense than a cognitive sense. So I'm sensing that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I saw Etta back there.
I'll use this mic. And what you're saying, Seth, is making me think about Marcy's question, like, is metaphor even necessary? For me, I feel like metaphor is I personally just don't feel like metaphor is necessary, because I have the sense of God's presence. And I think that going back to
the question was, did you get there through metaphor?
So I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to finish my original thought, which was in the first question about like, how comfortable are we talking about God? I think in my experience, there was a point in my life where I was really unsure about God and really uncomfortable talking about God. And then I joined gospel choir and hung out with a bunch of people who like had really strong convictions, understandings about God, and started talking to people from a variety of faith backgrounds about like, well, how do you know? Like, how do you know that God is real, right? And there was a certain universality in the experiences that people were describing to me about when they understood God's presence, that I was just like, okay, if all you people from all these different places are like having this universal experience, then like maybe I should just accept it. And part of how I've come to my faith is by just like claiming God for myself. And in the Christian hegemony, it feels so hard to talk about God, knowing the way that the power of the concept of God has been wielded. And I just feel like in my secular work in early childhood, I just talk about God a lot and like covenantal relationships, and like it has helped me to feel closer to that present sense that I have. Anyway, that was somewhat tangential, but those were all the things I've been
that was really
for the last
very
45
helpful.
minutes.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
And Kate Levin on here says she agrees with Edda. For her, religion is about belief, but connection to God is an experience. That might be Marley too.
Religion is about belief, but connection to God is an experience. Very interesting. Yeah, Rena?
Hi, this is Rena. I'm about to take us in another turn. So if anybody wanted to react to Edda. Okay, here's the other turn. I recall in a distant study session that we talked about God as a verb. And that really resonated back then with me and continues to be, that it's this whole concept that as you do God, as you God in your life, that's how you find, that's, so it really worked for me. Obviously, I still can't talk about it very clearly.
No, it's hard to articulate. I think like by nature, it's really, really hard to articulate this stuff.
I love that. If you God in your life, that's it.
And Tara and I are saying,
this is Deb.
This is Deb. Thank you. Tara and I are saying that God is really an adverb too. We got
God is an adverb.
Being godly.
Let's have a grammatical battle.
Okay.
Let's let him get back to what he was saying.
I once met a dog named Adverb, on a side note. Yeah. It is like God and dog.
Okay. Now we're really getting to it.
I think we've gotten some of the chats.
Yeah, we're caught up in the chat.
Okay, great.
Oh, wait.
This is Erica. I just wanted to say just a little comment that it's learning that Ahia is kind of future like.
Yeah.
Is very disconcerting to me. I always heard it as I am that I am, that I am. And the idea that he's not yet is kind of confusing. I don't know what to do about
Well, so I think it's this thing of multiple things can be true, right? Because also in Adon Olam it says V'hu haya, V'hu hoveh, V'hu yiyeh, V'tifer, that God was, God is, God will be. And I think it gets at this notion that's really central to Judaism, that two things can be true at once, I think, especially about God. So the notion that God is both in process and God has also always been, I think it is a cognitive dissonance to a certain extent, but I think that's kind of where, like, that's the fun stuff. To me anyway, I think it's great. I like really enjoy the cognitive dissonance and trying to figure out like, how's this working?
But for you, Erica, you're saying it's disconcerting.
Yeah.
Well, it just was a little disconcerting. Yeah. That it just a little disconcerting. Like, what do I make of this? But just one other thing about whether we need metaphor is even when the Kabbalists try to get away from metaphor and talk about God as the Ein Sof, even then, end, like an ending, is a metaphor.
Right.
Right. The notion that Beli Reshit, Beli Tachlit, the without beginning, without end, or the Ein Sof, Ein Sof is the aspect of God that is above the aspects of God. It's the way up, right? Yeah, that's really helpful. That's a really interesting thought.
I'm going to jump in.
Yeah, please.
We were not caught up in the chat. Claudia, so as a counterpoint to your feeling of being disconcerted, Erica, Claudia is saying, I resonate to God as the unspeakable, unknowable, unfolding of being. Yeah.
Putting it in the future. Well, and as I like, I think it is really important that it's not exactly the future. It is this weird tense that is both the present and the future. So I think there's a sense in the Ehyeh that God will always be too. I think is maybe part of the idea is that God always was, God always will be. Yeah. Any other thoughts on Ehyeh? Yeah, please.
Well, it's really on the verb idea that Marina brought up.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about, we are created in the image of God. And so this way of I mean, again, it's abstract, but like whatever it is we do in our lives that feels right, that feels holy, that feels kind, just, bringing justice, that is connection to God.
You're a Kaplanian. Very good. Mordechai Kaplan says God is the force that makes for salvation. God is that which compels us to do good and to make beauty in the world and to be kind to each other. That's what he talks about. That's what God is. Yeah.
All right, this is Seth again. One thing that's striking me as interesting is normally it seems like when we talk as Jews and we try to figure stuff out, when people ask me what it is like to be Jewish, I usually say we don't really talk about God and heaven and hell all that much. But when we pray, when I look at the English, it's all like praisey. And that's why a lot of times I won't even hold this to do. I just kind of like almost go with the vibe of it, like a nigun. And so for me, it's really interesting that to me, and even like the Chabad people say like, it's better to be on earth than to be in heaven, because on earth you can do good deeds and it's about the mitzvot. So it's interesting to me that we don't talk about God all that much, and we're not like always prostrating ourselves.
Not so much, yeah. And I mean, that was like, my experience working as a hospital chaplain with all Christian chaplains is they talk about God all the time, constantly, and rabbis don't a lot of the time. Surprise! Yeah, please.
This is Rebecca Canner. When Tara talked about us being created in the image of God, I flipped it and thought, well, God is created in the image of what we want to be. So what we hope to be, all the good in the future.
That's lovely. I love that. Well, and I don't know if you noticed there's a nice comment in the chat there, but when we did our Saturday morning service and we did the Birchot HaShachar, there's I can't remember the Hebrew, but the translation was, "Blessed are you, imageless one, who made me in your image." That's confusing. But I think it's this thing of God is we are created in the image of God, and God is imageless. So what does that mean? Like, yeah. In the chat, please.
Yeah, so Kate saying, or this is Marley saying, God saying this before entering relationship with the Israelites suggests a mutability of the relationship yet to come. In a way, you will come to know me as I will be. Understanding the present state of Hebrew slaves is not the way we will understand God in the future, and suggests an openness to this change.
Love that. That is a deeply Reconstructionist idea. I like that a lot. Beautiful. Yeah, that's great.
Hearing what this is Eta's comment. I've just been rereading Harry Potter, which I haven't read it since I was a kid. It's really fascinating to read it as an adult. But it's almost like this idea of being created in the image of the imageless one is like, God is actually, here's a great metaphor, just like the room of requirement. Like when you need it, you open the door and whatever is in, like the door appears when you need it and you open the door and whatever you need is in that room at that time. And sometimes the door is there and sometimes it's not. And there's different things in the room every time.
So Judaism is an evolving civilization and God is an evolving God, actually. God evolves to meet the needs and needs of people and time and the environment. But God, that's a really interesting thought.
Greg is saying if dolphins wrote the Bible, then the Bible would state that dolphins were created in the image of God.
I think that's probably true. I think that is probably true. There'd be a lot more comments on, fish and that sort of stuff. Or they're like, yeah, God is all of this. Yeah, over here.
Hi, this is Deborah Fish. I think it's worth considering that God has to meet the needs not only of people who want to be just and good, but people who don't, or people who, like all of us, believe we're doing the right thing, but in reality, a lot of us would question that. So what does that mean for our metaphor?
It's a really good question. Well, so like I hate to keep referring, I'm a rabbi, I can refer to the Talmud. So the Talmud said, there's a section in the Talmud that says, you can't bless one God for the good and one God for the bad. It's all God. Which historically is a rejection of Gnosticism, the notion that there's like a light and a dark and there's like two God. But it really is this notion that no, if everything comes of God, that means evil too. And that means war and that means suffering. That's really good. This is like one of the great questions of all theology. Yeah, Deb.
And God creates us, and the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov. That's about us, not about God, is that right? So God is not only everything, but he creates everything about us. And then we just, the one you feed, that whole metaphor about which way you go, the wolf,
Right, exactly.
Which wolf wins, the one you feed. And so something in there.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so we have 10 minutes left. So I want to get to our last one here because I promised you said 3:15.
It's 3:06.
It's 3:05.
All the clocks.
No, I did no. I made the comment to Etta. I think what I said that one is slow and that one is fast. There's two, and I was like, it wouldn't be a Jewish space if there was two clocks that were both wrong in the different directions. Okay, so since I promised we would do the Shema, we'll jump down to God as Echad. Okay, so our text here, I think you may have heard it. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, Yud He Vav He is our God. And I wrote alone, but Yud He Vav He is Echad. Let's say that. So Echad means one. So how do you interpret when you say God is one? Does that mean God is alone? Like God alone? Or does that mean God is oneness for you or something different? Oneness. I'm seeing a lot of oneness. Does it mean something different for anyone else? Yeah.
This is Deb again, Deborah Fish, sorry, one of many Debs. I always felt that this was a comment on there being only one God in contrast to those other religions that had so many.
Interesting. Yeah, and so this is a moment to offer a little bit of historical context, which is really helpful to hear, which is that Judaism is a monotheistic religion. Israelite religion, which is pre-Judaism, was not so much a monotheistic religion. And there's lots of evidence of that in the Torah. The fact that one of God's names is Elohim, which is plural, means gods. That's weird. And so what it comes down to is really in pre-rabbis, even a little further back than that, the God of Israel was our God, but that's not to say the only God. It's just our God, our favorite one. We think our God's the best. But there's this real notion and this real evidence that no, there's this actual complex system with lots of different gods, and this just happens to be ours, really far back. There's the notion that in ancient Israelite religion, Yud He Vav He, the tetragrammaton, is the male consort of the Shekhinah, of the feminine aspect of God. So this notion that God is the only God is really like a sort of later development, interestingly enough. So there's really, like, in our tradition, kind of this notion of many gods that transitions into monotheism, and kind of why Judaism is so unique was that transition. Yeah. Other thoughts on oneness. So the notion maybe of God as one. So God as Echad. If Echad is the metaphor we're using for God, what sort of God does that picture, or does that paint for you?
Well, this is Carol Lesher. Going back to this idea of God as oneness, sort of everywhere, all-knowing, although not really thinking of that in an active sense. But I've always kind of thought of God as surrounding us and being kind of everywhere.
Yeah, which is a pantheistic notion. So I'm going to distinguish between those real quick. There were some folks at dinner who heard the spiel. You heard the spiel. I'm sorry. It literally was you who heard the spiel. Yes. So the pantheism versus panentheism versus theism. So theism is the notion that the universe is something and God is something and God acts on the universe, which I think a lot of us kind of feel like that notion doesn't work that well for us. So the other two options we have, I mean, there's lots and lots of options, but two of the other options we have, pantheism suggests that God is the universe and the universe is God, which I think is kind of what the oneness thing is about. That's how I take it to mean, is that all of us is just part of God. Everything in the universe is God, ultimately. For me, like, my own personal theology is that God is space-time. That's how I think of it. God is infinitely big in space and God is infinitely long in time. And we are just part of God that changes energy. We're alive for a while and then we go back to being a different part of the one. That's how I think about it anyway. But go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, this is Becky. Sort of in response to what you had said about oneness. I recall a long time ago in Los Angeles, I was doing a course at the University of Judaism, and I remember a rabbi talking about the name Yud He Vav He and the fact that there are no vowels there, and that it's almost like a breath, like if you say it out, and thinking of God as breath, another metaphor. And so since breath is something, the air we breathe is something that connects all of us in a way that would be sort of the metaphor for the oneness of God.
I love that. Well, and as best scholars can surmise, Yahweh, the tetragrammaton was maybe like as you're saying, very breathy, right? Yeah. Let's get these last few.
Yeah, I just wanted you to finish what you were saying about
you didn't say.
Yes, you're right. I lost track. Okay, thank you. Pantheism, which is the last one, suggests that the universe is a part of God. So the way you have to see this again, was I like to imagine God sucking in God's stomach a little bit, going, and whatever that little space is, that's where the universe exists. And that's the sort of notion behind Kabbalah, but behind Jewish mysticism, is that God had to withdraw God's self a bit to make space for the universe to exist. So it's a slightly different notion than pantheism, similar, but it's the notion that God is greater than the universe rather than concurrent with it.
Paul Resnick here. So it sounds like you're interpreting one as this oneness is all encompassing. Everything's part of it. And I sort of thought of one as being indivisible. It seems a little bit different. I'm curious whether that has come up.
I think that could work. I think certainly linguistically that works, that interpretation. Has that come up for me? Not specific.
Or has it come up for the sages or
the notion that God is indivisible? That's complicated because for the Kabbalists, clearly not, because God is way divisible, but also God is not divisible at the same time. So this is that thing where two things that seem like they can't be true at the same time are kind of true at the same time when it comes to God. So I don't have a specific example of that, but like there's traditions of both, God being very much divisible and God being not divisible, sort of at the same time, in similar traditions too. The sages were not mathematicians was the comment there. Yeah, some of them were, but anyway, yeah, Evan.
Hi, this is Evan. I realize what a one evokes for me in the use of this sentence is the way it's used in English, the word one, and I think also works in Hebrew. It is to specify someone anonymously, like one might think this. It's kind of like a reference maybe to a person, but it's a concrete concept of one without needing to specify one what. So it's kind of yeah, it's like an anonymity that says it's futile to try to specify God or to put a metaphor on it. At the end of the day, won't actually achieve anything. There's a concept that remains anonymous whether we like it or not.
That is really interesting.
My face literally just melted off.
In a good way. And I'm pretty sure in a good way. Okay, so we got 1 minute. I want to read Rabbi Tova's take real quick, and then I think we're going to have to wrap up here. So the Shema, which we recite multiple times over the course of she wrote this for the high holidays, that's why it says that, of the holidays, is not really a prayer, but a few verses of Torah that we use to wake ourselves up, saying, listen, Yud He Vav He, our God, Yud He Vav He is one. The word for one, echad, can be understood here as a name for divinity. What is the nature of oneness? In the Jewish mystical tradition, the biblical idea that the earth is filled with God's presence means that, in fact, everything is God. We perceive ourselves and the people and things around us as separate entities, separate from one another and from God, yet seek a deeper reality. Echad is a powerful metaphor for experiencing the fundamental connection of all living beings. It expresses the idea that whatever God might be, it is right here in our experience of each moment, accessible in all aspects of our lives, because ultimately, godliness is the stuff of all existence, which feels very Carl Sagan-y at the end. I like it a lot. Okay, so I think we're at, I would normally love to do like a final go around and what are you taking away from this? But I think we're at time. So I just want to say thank you so much for your really active participation. I hope this was interesting. If I was given the honor of joining this community, I think this would be a recurring thing. God talk is what I like to call it. So yeah, so thank you so much.
You're getting gratitude in the chat.
Gratitude in the chat, very good.
Gratitude for cool insights all.
Cool, snaps. We're a snapping community. I dig it. That's great. That's awesome. Awesome, great. Great, well, thank you so much.
Before we say goodbye to the people online, are there any announcements or things that need to be communicated to the Kahal?
We're not saying bye to them yet.
Oh, we're not saying goodbye to them. They're staying on?
Right? Aren't we staying on, Carol?
We'll get back on. I don't know if that's.
We're signing this off.
We're signing off. Thank you, everybody.
Bye,
everyone.
Thanks,
look forward to getting your evaluation forms later tonight, and please fill them out as soon as you can.
Thank you, Adam,
Our
and thank you, everybody.
Deadline is Tuesday at 8. Okay, we need feedback soon. PM. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yay.